Thank you very much, Rebecca, for giving Andrew and me the opportunity to talk about this work at an early stage in ESCoE's life. The topic that we're looking at is a democratic measure of income growth. Well, I will explain both why one might want a democratic measure of income growth and also how we propose to calculate it. Andrew will then show some of the numbers, and it will be up to you to decide whether it makes a material difference or not. As you all know, people focus a lot on GDP. It's a number that politicians like because they don't quite understand it and they suspect their audience doesn't quite understand it either, but it makes them sound technically experts. There are a number of things which are well known to be, to make it unsuitable as a measure of growth in welfare. First, it's gross of depreciation. A welfare measure certainly couldn't be gross of depreciation. Not only that, but the various redefinitions of GDP that we've seen over the last 10 years or so, putting more and more intangibles in, tend to put in more and more things as output that have high depreciation rates, so the gap between gross and net is probably getting bigger rather than smaller. Secondly, something which is material for the United Kingdom but very much more material for other countries. If you want to know what's affecting people's welfare, you have to take account of net income from abroad. Thirdly, there's the question, if you want to measure real income rather than output, how do you deflate it? About 10 years ago, a then colleague of mine, James Sefton, and I did some work which showed fairly clearly that the deflator used to calculate real income should be a consumption deflator, not the GDP deflator, so you can get terms of trade effects arising if, for example, the price of investment goods moves relative to the price of consumption goods. Then, an obvious point, some adjustment for population is needed, so certainly real net national income growth per capita is a much better indicator of change in welfare than is real GDP growth per capita. But if that were all I had to say, it wouldn't justify standing here this afternoon. Aggregate growth rates, or growth rates of arithmetic averages, weight together individual growth rates according to the level of income. If you look at the growth rate of average household income, we can work that out. What it means in practice is that you take the growth rate of each individual household's income and you weight them together according to the initial income of each household. So people who are high earners have more influence on the growth in the average than do people who are low earners. Put it another way, if a high earner's income goes up by 1%, it pulls up the average by more than if a low earner's income goes up by 1%. So you can reasonably say that that is a plutocratic measure of welfare growth. Essentially, the high earners count for more. And we hear more and more of the importance of statistics that reflect what's happening to ordinary people. Well, I'm not sure that you would want to leave out high earners completely, but an arrangement where they have more weight than low earners will be important for some purposes, but is a bit hard to defend for other purposes, and particularly if you want an average sense of what's happening to the population. So a democratic measure of income growth would instead take the growth in the real income of each household and average that across all the households in the economy. It would be the average of the growth rates of income rather than the growth of average income. Well, no, how new a thought is that? The influence for this work really comes from two former colleagues of mine, neither sadly still with us. Zig Price, who started working at the National Institute in 1955 and continued to work here for the first 10 years that I was director, in 1959 developed a democratic price index. The standard price index looks at the consumption bundle, the total amount people spend on food, the total amount people spend on fuel, on clothing and so on, and it uses those shares in the total to calculate a price index. You look at the change in the price of food, the price of clothing, the price of fuel, etc., and you weight them by their shares in total expenditure. Zig described that as a plutocratic price index. He suggested that as an alternative you might look at a democratic price index where you would take the share of each household's expenditure and average those shares across the household. So you would be looking at a basket which in some sense was the average household's shopping basket rather than a basket in which high earners, high spenders inevitably had greater weight because they have more influence on the total. Well, that was Zig's democratic price index, and I think it's fair to say that it has never been terribly prominent, although, well, I'll come on to the sources that we've used. Secondly, Tony Atkinson developed the idea of inequality-averse measures of income. He set out a fairly general framework where someone who wanted a summary statistic of what was happening in the economy could decide how averse they were to inequality, and your degree of aversion told you how to calculate the summary statistic. But Tony, as far as I know, only worked in nominal terms. He didn't think about the issue of deflation. Here we take the geometric mean of household income. Now that's a special case of Tony Atkinson's inequality aversion, and we deflate the growth, or we deflate the geometric mean of household income by Zig Price's democratic price index, and what that gives you is the average of the growth. What that allows you to work out is the average of the growth rates of each household's real income. So it's a growth rate averaged across all households, a democratic measure rather than a plutocratic measure. For those of you who like algebra, and who doesn't after all if you're an economic statistician, this is the principle set out here. The logarithm, y is the geometric mean of the incomes of individual households, so we can write the logarithm of y as the logarithm of a price measure plus the logarithm of a quantity measure, and that will be equal to the average, to the average price measure per household plus the average quantity measure per household. So what you get when you look at changes over time is that the rate of growth of the geometric mean, at least in the limiting case, is the sum of the rate of growth of Zig Price's democratic price index and the growth of the democratic quantity index, or the democratic measure of real income. So this essentially enables us to work out delta Q over Q. If we can get delta Y over Y from household survey data, we can get delta P over P in the way that Zig Price described, then we can use that to work out the quantity counterpart to Zig's democratic price index, and that I'm calling a democratic measure of real income growth. Well, of course, while put like that, it sounds very straightforward. Anyone who knows anything about economic statistics knows that what looks straightforward superficially never is straightforward. So what are the sort of things that we are having to address? Well, some of them have fortunately been addressed for us. First, you need to adjust household income for household size. That's a fairly standard process. It may not be true that two can live as cheaply as one, despite what Somerset Maugham said, but you need some adjustment. We have used a democratic consumer price index produced at the ONS by Tanya Flower and Philip Wales. That was done for the Johnson Review. We have got here results for household disposable income after housing costs taken, and those are taken from households below average income data set. A slightly odd data set, a slightly odd name, because it actually covers high income people better than most other sources. So Andrew's now going to present our results and show what their implications are.
So as Martin just said, HBAI is misnamed perhaps. It does include the entire distribution. So the income measure here is disposable income. So it includes all income from employment, all income from all investment income. It includes state benefits. It includes pensions, private and occupational pensions. And of course it's net of income tax and national insurance.
But no imputation for home ownership?
No. So this is after housing taxes, after housing costs. And as Martin just mentioned, it also, DWP also makes an adjustment to the series to account for under sampling of higher income people. So they replace some values from the survey of personal incomes, which is a 1% sample of HMRC tax data. So what you see here is both the geometric mean in nominal terms and also the mean. Both of these are in nominal terms. So you notice that the obvious thing to notice here is that these two things move together. They're basically the same over this period. So this would suggest that there isn't any increase in inequality over this time. So if these were diverging, if the geometric mean was much lower than the arithmetic mean, then that would suggest that there was some increase in inequality, at least in nominal terms. So this is the quantity side of our measure. We also need to think about the price side. So this is simply the growth in the difference between the democratic CPI and just the ordinary CPI. So you can see over this period, for most of the time, the democratic CPI has been growing faster than CPI. So this implies that prices of goods that average people buy have been rising faster than the average price of goods that higher income people buy. So it's also quite volatile. So we're still looking into exactly what is causing this volatility. We don't have so obviously fuel and seasonal food costs are a key dimension here of what's leading to this volatility, we think. But of course we don't have a democratic measure of CPI that excludes fuel and housing, fuel and seasonal food costs. But definitely fuel and seasonal food costs are playing a role in the volatility that you see here. So putting these two things together, the quantity side and the price side, what we have here is the democratic measure of income and the plutocratic measure. So these are both in real terms, again, the solid line here is the geometric mean. And so you can see that for the early period, from 2002 up until about 2006, these two series moved together. So that would suggest that in real terms there hasn't been any increase in inequality for that period. But then from about 2006 you can see that these two series really start to diverge, with the geometric mean income really underperforming relative to the arithmetic, the plutocratic mean. So, and looking across the entire period, you see that both the mean with the plutocratic deflator and the geometric mean also with the plutocratic deflator have both increased by about 5.4%. So obviously that's what you would expect given the nominal data that I showed you, and we're deflating by the same price deflator. But you also see that the geometric mean has increased by just 2.2%, substantially less than the plutocratic measures. So, I mean, we think that this is substantial, but I don't know what you think. So we can also look at the growth, and on here we've also got the growth in real GDP and the growth in real GDP per capita. So you can see that over most of this period, you can see that the growth in GDP and growth in GDP per capita has generally been higher than the solid line, which is the growth in our geometric mean, our democratic mean income, except for the period of the recession. But otherwise it's generally been higher. And as Martin said, I mean, and as probably everyone knows, I mean, there are lots of problems with GDP. As Martin said, it includes depreciation, so it's strange to think that depreciation on your car or your house really adds to your well-being. So we know that there are problems with GDP. GDP perhaps in some ways includes too many things, whereas our geometric, our democratic mean income perhaps includes too few things. So we're still working on this to add other things to it. So for example, the benefits that people get in terms of education and health care, and also undistributed income from pensions, for example. So ideally we'd like to add these things in to our measure of democratic income. And the other thing that we're working on is to try and improve this data. So this data comes from PWP, the HBAI. We're also looking at pooling this with ONS's data from the Living Costs Food Survey, or ETB, which is derived from it. And the other thing is to try and bring the Democratic Price Index up to date. So at the moment it stops in 2014, and we need to bring that up to date.